All the signs suggest the government will be plundering the massive welfare budget to pay for our added defence and border protection commitments.
Why is it that people with disabilities are having to fund the war against terrorism?
Rehabilitation will be available, and we'll try and encourage you to get a part-time job.
For decades now, Australia's welfare budget has been set amid political rhetoric about debt and deficits, difficult economic times, and a reasonable dose of ideology. Under John Howard and Peter Costello, the coalition variously targeted disability pensioners, suggesting a rising disability pension bill was a reflection of malingerers, and single mothers, in measures which cut back welfare ostensibly in the interests of helping them get back to work. But the welfare cutbacks were not all limited to one side of politics.
The government's been piecing together the final bits of this year's budget. She's promising it'll be true to Labor values.
Concerns about the reduction in payments for single parents.
Beneficiaries will now get the dole instead when their child turns 8.
In 2012, Julia Gillard now infamously presided over a further cutback in the support we provide to mothers raising children by themselves.
But the Prime Minister decided to go ahead.
A class of people who have been the subject of grandfathered arrangements are being put on the same rules as everyone else.
The government's always keen to take a baseball bat to families.
But this was not the only significant decision taken by Labor which helped change Australia's welfare landscape. In 2009, the Rudd government increased age pensions by $30 a week because they were judged to be inadequate. But as a result, the unemployment benefit as a percentage of the age pension started to fall.
It was around 90%, and now we're seeing it's about 66%.
The 33rd Parliament of Australia has been officially opened in Canberra.
Tony Wren came to Canberra in 1983 and has worked for both major political parties as an advisor on welfare policy, so knows the history of the debates well.
There's a heap of benefits available to us young groovers.
She is one of several analysts who note the deliberate move in government policies that favour older Australians, which escalated in the Howard era.
Howard put a lot of money into making the age pension much more generous. He relaxed the assets test, the income test.
He gave them generous benefits. He got rid of all taxes. He helped people with superannuation. The superannuation concessions are just extraordinarily generous, or certainly were at the time.
While age pensions were becoming more generous, a new approach to some other welfare payments was introduced in 2006 under reforms known as welfare to work.
What we saw was much more punitive. Instead of welfare being something that everybody, it was basic, like the age pension, it was something you're entitled to. It became much more a transaction that you have to do something in order to get it. We hadn't seen that before. And of course, nowadays it feels so normal, but that was new to really link the payments and activities.
Anne Summers has also witnessed many of these policy and political changes as a political correspondent in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and as a bureaucrat and policy advisor.
What was, I think, very, very sad about that time was that it sort of broke us apart. That we'd been a more equal society up until that point, and politics had tried to sort of keep it that way, even under the Fraser years, which were, we thought at the time were harsh.
The arrival of the Abbott government saw the welfare debate enter a new rhetorical realm.
We are a nation of lifters, not leaners.
The end of the age of entitlement,
which peaked with robo-debt and the rhetoric of Scott Morrison.
Could the Prime Minister live on the New Start rate of $40 a day?
The best form of welfare.
The Prime Minister resume his seat.
The best form of welfare is a job.
Recent comments from the current Treasurer left some people thinking not a lot had changed.
But do you think that you could live on $49.60 a day?
It is tough to live on the JobSeeker payment, and that's why we want to move as many people as we can off that payment and into good, secure, well-paid jobs.
I find it really disappointing. I think people recognise, given the cost of living crunch across the country that we've seen, that there are so many people doing it tough. I want to give the government the benefit of the doubt running into the budget, but let's be clear, as it currently stands, Scott Morrison was more generous when it comes to increasing the rate of JobSeeker and youth allowance and other payments. I'd argue that people vote for Labor for more fairness, to actually invest in people.
The Treasurer and the Albanese government's Expenditure Review Committee have been facing the most intense campaign in years to finally address the level of payments like JobSeeker, which contribute to an estimated 3 million people living below the poverty line in Australia. That campaigning has included members of the government's own backbench. Perhaps more significantly, we are also seeing a change in the way we conduct the conversation about welfare, away from the tendency in the last 20 years to characterise people as deserving or undeserving of society's help. That's partly because of the sea change in politics that occurred at last year's election with the rise of the parliamentary crossbench and particularly the advocacy of a key Senate vote. Independent Senator for the ACT, David Pocock.
We often hear people on welfare being talked about as numbers, as statistics, as a drain on the budget, rather than recognising these are people in our communities.
Not everyone is on board for this shift. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has repeatedly focused on further easing the limits on how much those on the age pension can earn without losing their pension. And when he was asked yesterday about the merit of lifting the JobSeeker rate for those over 55, he said,
"We need to make sure that we can increase participation in our country, not decrease it. So we want incentives there for people to be able to work if they have a capacity to work."
Separate to the campaign to raise the JobSeeker rate has been one to improve the position of single parents by restoring their rights to parenting payments until their children are older, overturning the decisions of both the Howard and Gillard governments to force single parents onto the dole when their children turned 8.
To me, it goes back to this attitude that seems to be so deep held in so many parts of Australian society that we really have a problem with single mothers. We think they're either sluts or welfare cheats. Whereas the reality is, and the research that I've done bears this out, the reality is that 60% of single mothers have either been married or were in de facto relationships. A huge number of them left those relationships because of domestic violence. And so we are punishing these women with poverty, what I call policy-induced poverty.
With 35% of Australians now renting compared to just 10% a couple of decades ago, soaring rents in the past 12 months are hitting a lot of people hard. For low-income renters, the share of their disposable income going straight to the rent has been steadily climbing since the 80s.
We have got hundreds of thousands of Australians living in poverty, and the government has an opportunity to change that at this budget.